All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the July Hampton Roads Power BI user group meeting. Wanted to be respectful of our speaker and get started a little bit on time so that she can share everything with us without running out the door. We have a lot of new faces I saw in the attendees, so just want to give a little introduction real quick. My name is Brian Knox. I've been running the user group since we began. Our goal obviously is to promote Power BI in the area, but also I think with these virtual webinars we've been doing recently have been helping get us some excellent speakers such as today. So just a little future information. We are looking to go hybrid, but right now I think you get the opportunity to have some excellent speakers with this virtual approach. So I think in the future we will have some hybrid meetings where maybe the speaker's virtual, maybe we can have virtual attendees, but also we'll be in person so we can get some networking going as well, because there's a lot of new people that have joined the group that I haven't been able to meet. So that's pretty exciting. We've had steady meetings the past couple of months, and we've got steady meetings in the upcoming months as well. So that is our goal, is to just have continuous content to share with you all. Going through our agenda for our meetings, I like to give a couple announcements about the group, such as that one, latest Power BI updates, and then pass it on to our presenter. At the end, if you stick around, I'll tell you how you can get entered into a raffle for an Amazon gift card. Our biggest announcement, we've added a member of our leadership team. Richard Siri of Ferguson Enterprises has began helping me out. He's actually new to the group. He attended last month's meeting and we met as well, but he'll just be helping out find new speakers and generate great content for everyone. And then I'm continuously plugging the new Microsoft community websites, because at community.powerbi.com, they now have a resource for user groups. It's no longer a third party. It's built directly into Microsoft, and you can actually get there straight from their website, which is pretty cool. And we have a site there that has the same content as Meetup. We're still keeping Meetup because that's where most of our members are, but you'll be able to attend the meetings and get the webinar link from there as well. Kicking off July Power BI updates, there's a lot I could have covered, but I kind of just grabbed some highlights because I know it's hard to keep up with everything that is new, especially when there's new stuff every month. The biggest thing, at least for me, I like the conditional formatting's continuously expanding. They've actually added it in 10 more locations. And then Power Automate has its own visual, so you can build Power Automate directly from Power BI. It kind of works just like a mini Power Automate interface, but within the tool, so that's pretty nice. I don't know how many people are using Amazon, but there is a new data connector which allows you to query S3 buckets directly. And then a big one is streaming data flows, which allows you to connect to Azure datasets directly, but right now it's a premium only feature. But that does allow you to use premium per user, which is a pretty cost-effective way to try out some premium features. There's a lot more stuff all the time, updates and things going general availability this month, but these are some of the highlights. And then I'll just pass it on to our speaker. So our featured presentation today is all about increasing the trustworthiness of your Power BI content, presented by the great Melissa Coates, and I will hand it off to her. And then after that, we will close with our raffle.
Sounds good. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to steal the sharing from you. So hopefully that switches over here in just a moment. Alrighty, hopefully you can see me, hear me, and see my screen. So hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you. I'm Melissa Coates, and I'm talking to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. So as Brian said, we're going to talk about trustworthiness tonight. So first, just a quick little moment about me. I'm self-employed. which is marvelous, other than I can't stay within a project plan and a timeline to save my life because I'm not accountable to anybody else. But besides that, it's wonderful. And I spend most of my time these days on Power BI governance and administration type of topics. And at the moment, most of my time is being invested in two things. One is a training course that I have, and there's a link down here. I'll let you check it out if you're interested in these kinds of topics. And the other thing is doing a lot of technical writing for Microsoft. And just earlier this month, we released a new piece of documentation. So I actually wanted to announce that here. They haven't had a chance to get a blog post out on the main Power BI blog yet. So far it's basically been, Twitter and LinkedIn and that kind of thing. But this is all about helping organizations with what's involved with adopting Power BI successfully. And we tried to hit most of the things that are more difficult than the technology itself. So a lot of the people aspect and that kind of thing. So although I'm the primary author of the content, I did so with Matthew Roche from the CAT team. So if you follow his blog or his data culture series, you'll obviously recognize a lot of common themes that are there. All right, so here's what we're talking about tonight with regard to trustworthiness. I'm going to start out briefly with just why do we care? Then we're going to get into data sets, data flows, composite models, just a few very tactical things that you can do to increase trustworthiness and what you might do and why it impacts it. Then we'll get into certifying content a little bit. By item number 6 here, we're going to then talk just a little bit about why we would actually want to start thinking about our workspace design in this realm and what effect that might have. And then I'm going to wrap up finally with just a few things about data discovery. So once you've gone through all this effort, helping your colleagues discover this great data and content that you have and how they can get more out of it. If you want a copy of these slides, hit my presentations page at my website. So coatesdatastrategies.com or coatesds.com for short on the presentations page. And this one is at the top. You can download a PDF of the slides. And then the other thing I will mention before we dig in is I will stop for questions at the end of each one of these sections. So we've got 7 really good natural breaking points. I'm going to rely on Brian to help determine what's worth asking at that point, but feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat as they come up. But here we go. So let's start with just a quick why. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
One, you do have to share your video separately. So if you want to do that, there's a section in the middle where you single source or content left.
Oh, so you didn't see anything I just showed you?
The screen's good, but your video is separate.
Oh, I thought I redid that. Okay, let me.
It won't let me do it for you because you're the one sharing.
Yeah. Private preview only, you can see this. I shouldn't have turned it off. I got my correct thing. I don't know why it's private. I don't see, all I see is blur my background, more background effects, and a choice for camera, which it's got the correct one.
Underneath the Q section, there's 2 little boxes, one with a line to the right, and then one that just says single source, content left. You can add video by clicking content left.
Oh, how about now? Do you see it? I see a box with me in it now that I didn't before, but I don't see any of the things that you're saying. So on my side,
Sorry, It's not letting me do it.
Yeah, all I have is a switch camera in my ellipsis.
Oh. Okay. I think I got it.
Okay. Well, hopefully it works, and if not, Okay, so let me start with a quick, why are we so concerned with this? And as you would expect, we have got a few different ways that we deliver Power BI around the organization. We might deliver enterprise BI in a very centralized way on the left. We might have very decentralized self-service BI where business users are creating a lot of content. And then we've got the tier in the middle where we might have certain people that own the data and certain people that own the reports. And this is a common thing that we like to talk about a lot from a data culture perspective and a change management perspective, but this has a big impact on just sheer trustworthiness as well, because we have more authors that are publishing content if we're working on the right side of this screen here. Now, the other thing that, before I move on, that I really want to mention is, even though we're always talking about this center column saying, hey, this is where we want to be, right? Centralize the data and allow more people to create reports from that data. And I'm going to talk about that technique tonight. It's an important technique, and Microsoft calls it discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. But here's the thing, even though things like this always say IT is going to own the data, or the BI team, or your center of excellence, or whatever, that is not 100% true. Anybody that wants to be a little bit more cognizant about how you're managing your data can take advantage of everything that I'm about to talk about tonight. So if you're an analyst sitting in a functional business unit, you can do all this stuff in the middle column, even if you're not sitting in IT or the central BI team. All right, so when we're talking about trustworthy content, of course, we're talking about data quality. That goes without saying, and we'll talk a bit more about that at the end of this session. We're also talking about things like common definitions, and that's really about helping people understand the data and make sure that we're consistent. But the thing is there's context to definitions, and my big thing is either use the common definition and the common term, or if you're going to differ from it, and there's a ton of legitimate business reasons why that you would, just how does the consumer of the report know that, you know, net sales or net profit or whatever this thing is, you know, how do you define a lead in a sales pipeline, right? What exactly does that mean? Just make it easy for them to know. The actual responsibility and ownership of the content is clear, so that can help people assess, oh, who produced this and how much do I trust it, and or who do I go to for questions? And things like the data provenance and the lineage. So we want to be able to trace that data back to what's the original authoritative data source and how did that data change and move over time, because that definitely affects the trustworthiness by the time we get it all the way downstream in a report. One of my favorites, we're not duplicating our data unnecessarily, right? And that's that whole managed self-service BI middle tier that we just spoke about, and we're going to talk about some more here in just a few moments. Our data and our load processes are managed well and secured well. And you might say, well, I am an analyst sitting in a business unit, just getting my stuff done. I'm not creating ETL pipelines. But I say you are. If you are doing a bunch of data prep and you're doing a bunch of data modeling and releasing a lot of data and report for others to use, you do have data management processes within the realm of the solutions that you're managing. Awareness of content. This is about data discovery, having it be findable by your authorized users. And we'll talk about that way at the end of this session. And then the last one is really just about clear expectations, right? What are we allowed or not allowed to do with the data? All right, so that was our quick why. Before I jump into shared data sets, I don't see any questions, so I will just keep moving on. Where I want to start with is shared datasets. And where most content authors start is one data set or data model. I might use those terms interchangeably. One of those per Power BI file. So you might say I have a report or a PBIX file, and each one has a data set per report. So here, what this is showing is I have 3 of them, and they're all sales oriented. And this is natural. Everybody that starts and sits down with Power BI Desktop initially is going to go through this. It's just a matter of what point do they progress to something besides having one data set per report. So you might say, I got that covered. I'm just going to put everything into one Power BI file. Well, you might get that file being very unwieldy, not just from the data perspective, but also from the reports perspective. If you start getting 20, 30, 40 pages inside of one Power BI file, that's not very tenable. So here's where we really want our experienced authors to get to, and that's about decoupling our data in our reports. So here I'm depicting, one sales data set, and then these 3 other reports are just connecting up to it. And what's actually happening here is I'm just using a shared data set. Now it does have to be published to the Power BI service for this to work. So if we're just working in desktop on a file system, this isn't going to work, but there's a million reasons why you want to use the service anyways. So once we've got that data set out there, we can do a live connection. And so, here I'm showing one Power BI report connecting, one paginated report connecting. I can even use Excel to connect a couple of different ways. Even if we call it Analyze in Excel, it's conceptually the exact same thing as a live connection. And if you've ever heard bloggers talk about either the hub and spoke method or the golden data set and thin reports, that's exactly what we're talking about here. And so this is a very common practice. The reasons that we like this, number one is if you've got different people that are handling the data model, so that would be here versus the various reports, well, we now have different PBIX files that people are working in, so we're not having to deal with sharing those files and that sort of thing. So it really facilitates that. And that in turn, that middle tier that we talked about at the beginning with the managed self-service BI, it really promotes that, because then we can have the people that need what they need from a report creation standpoint, they just connect up and do what they need to do. And because we have fewer data sets, and I am not saying you need one data set for everything in your whole sales department. That might make sense for you, but I'm not claiming that you necessarily have to do that. But you have fewer inconsistencies and you have reduced maintenance and less data validations to do. And even from a compliance perspective, let's say you are asked, where's everywhere you're storing a customer name? Well, if you have 3,000 data sets across your entire organization, which does happen with these huge global companies, that's a big deal, as opposed to if you're managing a much smaller number. This also helps usability, right? Because the actual report files are targeting what you need them to target. And performance, fewer data set refreshes. So if you have any sort of picky source systems and you're waiting for Power BI to refresh in the morning, or what I've seen a customer do is they schedule multiple refreshes in the morning because they're not quite sure when the source is going to be done. So they scheduled it every half hour for like a 3-hour time period to make sure that, yep, it'll get done one of these times. But they had to do that for a whole bunch of different data sets, right? So we can minimize some of those pain points. And we get extra security options. We're going to talk about this in section 6 when we're talking about the different workspaces. So I'll hold on that to elaborate then. Now, it's not perfect. There are disadvantages, and because we are literally creating dependencies of all these reports on a data set, that means we have to have more process and more change management and much more careful data ops, if you will. And so if you're running really fast and you have just something that's only going to live for 3 months, some analysis, don't over-engineer it. We don't have to use this for absolutely everything. And then the other thing is, depending on who owns and manages that data set versus the reports, there may be some disagreements about, well, if we want to make some edits to that original data set, who's gonna approve it and who's gonna get it done. Now, the new capability direct query for Power BI data sets that we're going to talk about in a few minutes does alleviate that pain point to a certain extent, for sure. Last thing I'll mention is complacency. Just because you're using the golden data set doesn't mean that you don't have to test your reports. So there's still lots of different ways that you can screw up the data that you are presenting on a report. So just kind of be careful of that one. All right, so you know what we're talking about now. Let me just show you a couple of quick things. And where I want to start here is with my sales data set, and I'm going to go and take a look at its lineage. And really, what this is telling me is I have a data set right here, and it's telling me I happen to be in the sales data workspace, and it's a sales data set, which is not necessarily something that I encourage. However, in my demo environment, I do certain things for certain reasons. But one thing that I would like to point out over here on the right is that we have got a bunch of reports over here in the sales analytics workspace that are dependent upon this particular data set. And so this is a really good thing to keep an eye on. We see that in my particular demo environment with, my massive 2 users, there's one that's run more often than others. Now, the other really interesting thing here is if you're about to make a change to this particular data set, there's this little notify contacts button, and it doesn't tell you who the contacts are of all of these downstream items, but you can send a blanket message that says, hey, something's going to happen to the upstream data in this particular workspace, and your content's going to be affected. Now, that's all about, a downstream impact analysis, right? So if I go over to that sales analytics workspace where the reports are, and if I go to a report and I look at its lineage, this is a little bit different. This is, this is going to tell me that, oh, okay, this report here, it's dependent upon this particular data set that's over here in this particular workspace. And so this is more about upstream lineage. Where did the data come from? So 2 different ways to look at it, and those are both really important to kind of keep track of from our trustworthiness perspective. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is if I go out to Power BI Desktop and I do a Get Data Power BI Datasets, and here it's reaching out to the Power BI service, and we'll talk in a little bit. My certified data sets are coming up at the top, but here's that sales data set, and then I can go ahead and connect up to it and do what I need to do from a report creation perspective. And thankfully, in this live connection, several months ago, they started exposing the actual data model so the people creating the reports can at least see the data model. So that is progress for sure. All right, so let me shift gears back to our next step in the process, and I don't see any questions, assuming that I see the same meeting chat that you do, Brian. So
I do have a couple of questions. They're in a separate tab under Q&A.
I don't see a Q&A tab. So go ahead and just read them out to me. I will just rely on you then.
Sure. One is overall for the presentation, could wait to the end, but since we're pausing here, how does this translate to smaller businesses without IT departments? Some small to mid-sized businesses don't even have one IT person, so how do they handle sort of the administration side that we're covering?
Sure, and you know, other than, and let me pop back over here, we'll look at a couple of things throughout this that rely on certain tenant settings for the features to work. So, you know, for instance, there is a tenant setting for allow live connections. Now, I propose that that is usually just enabled for the entire organization because we do have the data security set up separately. But there might be a reason that you say, I have to have a particular group of approved authors and only our approved authors and consumers are going to be able to do this. That might be legit. But unless you really want to start locking stuff down like that, which the data security is super important. These kinds of features, I would not start locking down. This that I'm talking about is a habit change for your authors, right? They need to create the data set and publish it, and then create the reports and publish them, right? It's not an immense learning curve in terms of shifting that, you know, requires IT knowledge. So I would stick with no problem to use these techniques with some user education.
Awesome. And then the second one, do you find IT companies hesitant to adopt these newer deliveries, such as the blended self-service?
Yeah, and so let me, well, that is just behaving oddly. There we go. Let me go back to, here, let's be faster for a second. And we go here. So it kind of depends on your position for data democratization. And that link that we gave you earlier for the Power BI adoption roadmap talks about all this kind of stuff. But, you know, depending on your position for how freely you want various people in the organization to be able to connect to data and create their own content, right? Because the more you lean to the right side of what's on this page, the more inherent support you do have to have for people in your internal community of users. Because there's nothing worse, with some few exceptions, than saying, hey, everybody can have a license, just go figure it out, right? That's a recipe for quite a bit of chaos. Now, I'm not saying there's not a lot of smart people that can go figure it out. They will. But they will make mistakes and they need guidance. And that's why in that adoption roadmap, we talk about the center of excellence and we talk about user support and the internal community and all that kind of stuff. And that's the harder part of making this work. I'm talking about sort of the technical techniques that you can use, right? And, you know, the harder part is all of the rest of it for sure. So we talked about data sets and reusing them across multiple reports. So let's take this idea of data reuse and let's take it one step further. And inside of one Power BI file is where we do our Power Query work. That's all of our data preparation. And depending on how much work you need to do, that could be a lot of stuff going on in there. And so what can happen is the same thing we talked about earlier with data sets and, you know, repeated DAX calculations and all that kind of stuff. You get all of these M scripts inside your query editor that are repeated across, you know, every data model that you have. So the thing that we want to improve with the idea of this is decoupling the data preparation from the model. So what we're starting with here is I've got 3 data sets, and they're all shared data sets, and I've got 5 reports across the bottom. Okay, fine. All of those shared data sets are going to get at least some of their data from a data flow. And here I'm just calling it a customer master data flow. And this data flow is going to do its data preparation work up in Power Query Online. So instead of it being locked inside of one Power BI desktop file, it's basically centralized. And, you know, if not only do you have different people doing the reports and the data sets, you might have different people that work on the data flows. And so this really facilitates that if you have different roles and responsibilities. And if you have really rough source systems, especially if you're querying APIs and stuff that has, you know, limits or is just complex, you can shield the people that are doing the data set work. You can shield them from all of that source system stuff because they can just get that prepared data from a data flow. And that reduces the effort for your data set authors. That helps us reuse common data. A date dimension is a perfect one that, if it's consistent across a variety of data sets that are created in your organization, that kind of consistency with things like date and customer and region just helps not only your authors, but even your consumers, if in fact they're able to poke around and look at what that underlying data set looks like. And if you've got things like annual budgets that you need to distribute to lots of different teams, perhaps, or let's say you've got a lot of different data set authors that need to implement row-level security, and you've got some standard security mappings. Now, maybe they're going to go get those mappings from, say, a SQL Server table, or they can get them from a data flow, right? So you've got this idea of just reusing common different types of data. I'm not going to go into this rabbit hole, but behind the scenes, the data in the data flow is stored in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And you don't even know that it's there unless you configure things to say, I actually want to use my own data lake. And so from a data reusability perspective, that helps us reuse data even further. If in fact you say, I want to connect up my own data lake, and then the data flows store their data there, and then from, say, other tools, you can go and actually see and access that data behind the scenes. We talked about the reduced load and simplifying the source systems, fewer permissions needed to the source systems too. That can be a really tricky one to get done, and just overall improved consistency. So because we want the data flow to be reused a whole bunch of different times, what we want you to do is put as much as you can into that data flow. So friendly table and column names, your data types, any columns that you need either added or removed. So improving consistency turns around and improves trustworthiness when there's just things that look familiar, and, you know, reduces the cognitive load for people that are downstream from this. So let me show you a couple of things on this. If I go out to my common data workspace, and I have just one data flow. It's super simple. I have 3 tables. It's actually not a streaming data flow. The label is off right now. They'll get that fixed, I'm sure. But if I go in here and I edit tables, the only thing that I want to point out at this point is that this is just your familiar Power Query, right? This looks just like it looks in Power BI Desktop. Yes, there's a few feature differences, but if you like to do all of your work in Power BI Desktop, which does have more features, you know, you can just copy and paste this script up into the data flow when you're done, and you don't even have to work in the web if you don't want to. So it's very familiar from the perspective of the business user that's used to working in Power BI Desktop to making this shift, right? To go back to the person that asked about IT, You don't need IT to be able to do this. Now, the other thing, if I fire up a new Power BI desktop file, the other really huge thing that I want to emphasize is that just because we're telling people, and by people I mean your dataset authors, that you can get data from a data flow doesn't mean we're limiting what they're able to do. So I'm going here into Get Data and under Power Platform, and I'm going to choose Power BI Data Flows here. And I'm going to hit Connect. And under Common Data, there's those company-wide DW tables we were talking about. Let me just choose my date dimension, and I'm going to hit Transform Data, because what I want to do is point out, guess what? You just go into Power Query inside of Power BI Desktop. So if you need to do some extra work, you can. Go ahead. Bash it up with something else, change it, whatever you need to do. So you're not limiting people, you're just giving them a cleaner starting point. Let me pause there and see if there are any other questions before we move on to the next topic.
Nothing right now.
Okay, sounds good. Composite models. So we talked about that idea of a live connection, right? But here's the big kicker, that to do a live connection, you have to have all of the data you need in the data source. Although you can see that data model, we can't edit it, we can't mash it up with other data sources. That has been the limiting factor to live connection for years now, until now. So what we want to do is take things a step further with composite models. And one type of composite model is what we would call direct query for a Power BI dataset. And if we take a look at this right here, you know, let's say we've got a report and it's pointing to a data set. It's pointing to another data set. And so what's actually happening here is, let's say the data set author is, we're working on this one right here. They take a live connection and they convert it into a direct query. And I closed that Power BI desktop file, but when we had that live connection at the bottom right, it says edit this, and that's what flips it from live connection to direct query. That means a lot. It means I can now start adding in extra data sources. I can create relationships and so forth. I'm not limited to just that one source that I did a live connection to, because I basically changed it to direct query. Now this is a little bit different than the direct query we've had for years. The direct query we've had for years we would call like it's operating against a storage model, such as a SQL Server. This is a direct query operating against our semantic model that's sitting in the Power BI service. And then we just, you know, add whatever other data sources we need and carry on. So this guy up here is a direct query, and then the report connects to the enhanced data model that's got, you know, extra stuff that's been added. Could be another data flow, could be an API, could be an Excel sheet, could be whatever. So what's happening here? This sales data set, we are basically referring to that as our remote model. And then once we've flipped that live connection to be a direct query connection, what we're then working with is in our local model. And so, you know, we've got the organizational data that we get from up there, and then we've add in our departmental data. And so the big thing here is that all of the stuff that we can get from what I'm calling the organizational model, right, isn't duplicated. We're not storing the data yet again. That is the direct query piece. And then the pieces down here are what's imported. So this, the SQL BI guys call this the holy grail of extending enterprise BI with self-service BI. So as you can expect, there's several advantages to this. We can extend that centralized model with new, sources, measures, etc. But we can also personalize that centralized model. So if we want to reformat or we want to rename some different fields in there, we can do so. And the renames, the metadata for that's actually stored down in the local model. Supports that whole idea of different people that take care of different pieces of data, promotes that whole discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge, that middle tier that we've been talking about, and certainly reduces duplication of effort, reduces risk for all the same reasons that we talked about again. But disadvantages. We are jumping to a remote model, so we can't expect performance to be as good. So test what you're doing, right? And it's still maturing. Quite a few limitations. They have a good list in the Microsoft documentation, but there is one that I want to call your attention to. Normally, if somebody is down here at this level at the bottom and all they're doing is looking at a report, normally we would only want them to have read permissions on the data set to support the underlying report. But guess what? What they actually need are build permissions on every data set that's in the chain. This is a temporary situation, but that is a little bit more over-provisioned than we want. And if you're not familiar with what I just said, build just means you can actually connect to that data set and create new content or build new content reports, as opposed to just being able to read it as a viewer of those reports. So they know about it. Lots of enterprise customers are saying that's a problem. The other thing to know, by the way, is that you can only go 3 hops on your chain. I don't know if that's temporary or not, but that's another limitation to know about. So I'm going to talk certifying next. Any questions that we want to handle before I do that?
Yes. As trustworthiness goes, would you say Excel files or SharePoint lists as an official data source is desirable?
So that's a tough one. We're about to talk about certifying content. And so let me answer that question after I introduce for everybody what I mean by certified content, just so that I'm not repeating myself or double backing. So let me hold that one for just a couple minutes, and then we'll double back to it.
Sure, that was the only question right now.
Okay. So we're talking about data reuse. And so if we want people to use a particular data set, the idea is, hey, we should certify it. That indicates this is trustworthy. Go ahead and use it for your various, types of analysis. Now, these I'm talking mostly about certified here, but let me qualify the 2 things that are called endorsements. Certified means the author or owner or subject matter expert, whatever lingo you're using, the owner of that data set says this is trustworthy. And that means some level of rigor has occurred, which is how I'm going to get back to the person that asked about Excel and stuff. As opposed to promoted. Promoted is more of just an amplification that, hey, this content is available. And you have to have permission in the tenant settings to be able to certify content. But anybody that has edit permissions on the content can promote it. So, if you're a member, contributor, admin on a workspace, you can promote anything in that workspace. So it doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy, it just means that it's something less than certified. Sometimes some companies, especially if you're huge, and especially if maybe IT or someone has put in some rules that are very restrictive for what can be certified, sometimes the smaller or the decentralized departments are saying that we're going to go ahead and use promoted, and here's what it means to us, because it's such a challenge to get it through the certification process. So promoted can be used a variety of different ways between different authors. Because I said certified means it's trustworthy. In my training course, I've got this whole list of, hey, here's the things that you want to do when you want to certify content, right? One of them is that you would have to decide if it's certified, would a flat file source or a SharePoint list be an acceptable data source? And the answer really kind of depends on what policies you want to put in place. If it's sitting in a dependable place and it's being maintained by dependable people, and it's documented, which we're going to get to towards the end of this presentation, I'm okay with it because we don't have to add complexity in the whole technical architecture just to pick it up and move it from a spreadsheet to a database table and make it harder to update, right? If it's documented and it's in a shared, secured location, I'm okay, as long as it's not a blind spot. But you might decide that self-service content that is not certified allows that, and enterprise content that is certified doesn't allow that. That would be a legitimate decision for you to make, depending on how things work in your company. So I know I basically said it depends as the answer. So, all right. So as far as endorsing content, so the certified or the promoted, even though I'm really just focusing on certified now, we basically have three categories of content here. We've got the data, we've got the reports, and then we've got our collection of reports and dashboards that we would publish in a Power BI app. What we can't endorse right now are dashboards, workbooks, or workspaces as a whole. Now, these three buckets of data reports and our set of content are actually super important distinctions, and let me explain why. So what do I mean by we're going to certify data? So let's start with a data set. If we're certifying this data set right here, so what's the next level down? Well, the next level down are the reports, and it's actually the report authors because they are connecting to that data set for their report, right? So that means they're basically saying, I trust that data set and I'm willing to accept it as a dependency for creating my report. I deal with a data flow, but this time we're basically targeting the data set authors, and the data set author is accepting the data flow as dependency and they trust it. Okay, so data certification targets authors. Report certification targets the consumers of the report. It just means you can trust the data to make decisions based on this report. So you can already imagine that rigor or that process to actually certify a report versus a data set looks a little bit different. Now, then we get into app certification. Oh, I've got 8 reports and dashboards inside of this workspace that we're going to include in the app, and we're going to set the whole app to be certified. And I'm going to show you in a minute what that looks like. That means, hey, you can trust everything inside this app to make your business decisions. So again, that's targeted towards consumers of the app. But we've got some persnickety problems with that, right? How do we collectively certify everything that's included in the app, especially if it's 10, 12, 15 or more things? And then we've got the idea about, we've got individual item endorsements in the workspace, and then we've got the app endorsement. So let me show you what I mean by all of that. So let me go back to my sales analytics workspace, Oh, yes, I'll close you properly. All right, I'm going to sort my content by the endorsement column. And I want you to notice here that I have 2 reports that are certified and I have 1 that's promoted. Now, the other thing to notice is that I've got a whole bunch more items that are included in the app that do not have any sort of individual endorsement. Okay. So if I go and I look at, say, just this, 1 particular report at the settings, endorsement is here. Again, anybody that has permission would be able to set it to promoted if they wanted to. I happen to be in the group that allows certification, so this is, I'm allowed to switch this. Otherwise, it would just be grayed out if you don't have permission. That's our individual item endorsement. Now, if I go up here to this nice little hidden spot up here, the ellipsis, and I go to the Edit App Endorsement, what's actually going to happen before I click it, I'm saying all these things that say yes, I'm saying that those are endorsed. So under the app endorsement, this is set to be certified. So you can see I've got just a little bit of a disconnect here. And so the result of that is that when I go and I just look at the app, regardless, remember I had only 2 items of all of them that were actually set to certified, but no matter what thing I look at down here, on my menu down here of all the reports that are in there, and my browser's cutting it off again just a little bit, which is weird, but the whole thing is set to be certified. Let me see if yeah, it's still cut off. Okay. Well, and so that's because this thing at the top of the page, okay, I got a little excitable with my mouse resizing. This thing at the top of the page is at the app level. So that's just a decision for you to make. If you start going down this road of certifying content and you're certifying the app, how are you going to actually handle the individual item endorsements? Okay. So let me. Any questions about that piece before I move on?
None currently.
Okay. All right, we've got 2 sections left. So, and they're both pretty short. So we're going to run a few minutes past 7, just to kind of let you all know time-wise, if you can hang out with us still. So let's build on this concept just a little bit more and talk workspaces for a second. So back to this whole idea that we have 1 data set and 3 different reports, right? And the crux of this is I have different people that are maintaining the data versus the report. And have you ever had a conversation if all of this stuff is sitting in a workspace and somebody that's working on, this report right here says, yeah, I promise I won't touch the data set. I'm only going to touch the report that I'm responsible for. That's the thing that we're trying to solve for. And so what we would do then is we would publish the data to its kind of workspace and the reports to their own kind of workspace. And this has some really nice advantages. So one of them is, whomever is responsible for maintaining that data, right? Whoever the data authors are, they get a workspace role in just the data workspace, right? So contributor, member, admin, whatever. Down on the report workspace, that's where your report authors, they get their workspace role. Again, contributor, member, author, let them write and edit content inside the report workspace, but then they only get a build permission up on the data set. So they can connect to it, they can see it, but they can't change it. So that helps protect that data set, which of course affects its trustworthiness level because you're not going to have accidental changes to it. But there's more to this whole thing. And I want to point out, by the way, that a lot of people also separate their data flows into separate types of workspaces as well. So I'm talking data workspaces, and so you might want to decide, does that include my data sets and my data flows, or is there, one more level of separation there? But we now know who's allowed to edit and who's allowed to view. And we said way at the beginning, clarity of ownership of content is very important. And so this really facilitates that. Helps us with security, especially, and here's the biggie, if you need row-level security to work, you have to do this, because otherwise, if you have permission to edit any content in the workspace, row-level security, if this were all in one workspace, it would just be ignored because you're not a reader, you're an editor. So if you need it to work for your report authors, this separation makes that work, which is a huge, huge win. The downside, because, of course, it's only fair, that does make us have more workspaces to deal with and manage and monitor, and, more for users to navigate. So, how careful do we want to be with what we create and what we name them, and, all that kind of stuff. So let me show you what these look like over in my demo tenant. So if I go back to look at my workspace list. So basically, now naming conventions are always really hard to enforce in Power BI, but in my demo tenant, anything that's got data in it is basically just a data workspace, and anything else, whoops, my bad, anything else is either just a report workspace or certainly could just be a combination one if, just a small team just needs one workspace for everything. We don't have to do this for absolutely everything. Now, there are a couple of things that I will point out that are really important to make this work. So under your workspace settings in your tenant settings, there is a setting here for use data sets across workspaces. You would have to have that enabled. So I would recommend that that's usually just allowed for everybody, and you let your actual workspace and data set and report security take care of who sees what. And then under export and sharing settings, there is, we talked about this one a little bit earlier as well, there is the allow live connections that would need to work to make this whole paradigm work well. All right, I just have one last little bit here, and then we can use whatever other time you all want to spend for the remainder of the questions that you have. So finding trustworthy content. Power BI has recently made some really good advancements here. So this is about data discovery, which is, an industry lingo term, just like data literacy and data democratization. We've got these things that can be hyped and a little overused and a little misunderstood. But data discovery is about, can I search for and find relevant data across the org? And the idea is we want to improve awareness that the data even exists, particularly when it's siloed in departmental systems that we would otherwise have no idea about. And so once we're aware that it actually exists, we go through some process to request access to the information. So this is only about exposing metadata, not the actual data. So the idea about making it more discoverable is, we reduce duplicate efforts, and, we reuse the work that somebody has done here, all of which certainly contributes to trustworthiness, right? So there is this thing that has been released several months ago now that was recently improved, but we've got the Datasets Hub. And so this is basically a list of all of the data sets that you have access to via a build permission. And so if I look at this list, I'm logged in here as a user that has access to a ton of different stuff. So I'm basically inside a browser window that is logged on as Peyton is my Power BI administrator. And I've got a separate window open where I'm logged in as Griffin, who is also an administrator. But if we look at his datasets list, he only has 2 things. And here's where things get interesting. So this one, call center data, he's got access to it. Sales data, however, though, and notice that the owner is even hidden. And if I hover on this sales data, we can see the nice little description that says, hey, this is sales by blah, 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 2 years of history. The description actually says this is the authoritative data set certified, and questions, contact the COE team. And so even though the endorsement says certified, we put that in the description as well. So since he doesn't have access, there is actually a little request access button so that he can say, I think this is what I need. So as you can see, a really good description, better than the one I showed, is really useful here. So if I go back to the user that actually has permission to that data set and I go to its settings, a couple of things that make the magic work. So first of all, here's that data set description. But here's the newest thing that has just come out. And underneath endorsement and discovery is this make discoverable property. So this means for this particular data set, people that don't have access to it can see it in their Datasets hub or when they search to be able to try to find it and so forth. And you do have to either promote it or certify it in order to even make it discoverable. So from a process perspective, right, there's some decisions to be made there about what's allowed and how you go about getting that done. So the last few things that I will leave you with thought-wise is, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, that process that you want to use to certify content needs to include, meaningful stuff, like review the data sources, review that data model, give it a technical review. Review the reports and the visualizations, do a security review, and I don't just mean RLS in the desktop file, I mean what's the target place, the workspace, and what kind of security is going to be imposed there, that kind of thing. Certainly data accuracy validation and documentation review. So if it's going to be certified, do you have a certain bit of documentation that is required or at least strongly suggested? So things of that nature are really important, and you want to make sure that it's consistently applied. So if there are 3 different data sets that are certified and they belong to 3 different departments, you can bet that the same level of trustworthiness applies to all 3. It's way easier said than done, but that's our goal. Documentation, right? You just heard me say that. We want to document things like, what's the purpose? What's the target audience? Are there any business rules that would be really useful for us to document? And this is not just for the consumers, very important for them, but it's also for you or somebody else that might maintain this data set later. And this could be as simple as a report page inside of a data set file. If we're talking on the reports, we could do tooltips and bookmarks. We could do a little information link and go out to a separate page like a wiki, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways you can implement this. It doesn't have to be fancy and it doesn't have to be a heavy thing. I like to see a change log, especially with the data sets, but who changed what and when. Just a little report page as part of that data set file is perfect. Data quality. So this is a huge topic, of course, but if you have a data quality dashboard, and of course here we're talking about those data sets that are really starting to be used by a lot of different stuff. So we want to be able to repeat that validation or that reconciliation process. And perform that again when something changes to the data set in a month or a quarter or whatever. And letting our report consumers see that data quality dashboard is a great thing. You might even give them an easy way to submit a question or a data issue that they are seeing. So if, from a data culture perspective, that thought about everyone's a data steward, if that is something that resonates and it's like, yeah, everybody that looks at the data, if they see something wrong, we want them to raise their hand. Things like this could work very well, as opposed to just making it available to the authors on the BI team, that sort of thing. And then we've got various properties at the workspace level and also the artifact, like a report or a dashboard or a data set. And we've seen a whole bunch of these different things throughout the session today. But all of these are really important and really helpful to help assess what do I have and so forth. So just to show you, I really mean it, that it doesn't have to be fancy. And it's funny because I've said this so many times that that I should make these better, but I've almost decided not to. So I'm inside my sales data workspace, and I've actually got a sales data report and data set. And you might say, but Melissa, you said earlier, this is a data workspace. Why do we have reports? Well, you know how you always have at least one report page when you're publishing from Power BI Desktop? I clicked the wrong one. How about I click on the report? A great purpose for those report pages are a change log, and this is really ugly, but only your content authors, your data set authors and such are going to see this. So here's a little change log. Here's a really ugly little data set documentation page. Could you make this better? Absolutely. Does it need to be? One of the things I like the best about it are things like, is there any future maintenance required? Now, we don't want to hard code things like dates and that kind of stuff, but it's the real world. We know people do this. Leave yourself a note. Are there any open requests or things we know we need to do later? Like, oh, yeah, we got this Excel file. We need to get rid of it later. Leave yourself a note. So I really like using report pages associated with the data set for this purpose once we've decoupled the quote unquote real reports. I think that concludes everything that I was going to cover from the presentation perspective. I'll leave some links up here for you to jump on if you need them while we handle any remaining questions that might be.
Awesome, thank you so much. Before we get to some questions, I did post the link to the form to fill out to win an Amazon gift card, so thank you guys for sticking in to the end. And then there is one of the questions I think you answered, but it's a very common question. So any recommendation for data cataloging and data dictionaries?
Yeah, so Azure Purview is still very young, but it's probably the first place to start looking. And that's because if you haven't heard of it yet, it's being billed by Azure as, a governance service, and that's true. So it does more than just we're about to talk about, but what you can do is you can have it scan your entire Power BI tenant, and it will then basically say, hey, you have all of these reports and all of these data sets, and give you essentially an inventory. So it used to be before the before the dataset discovery checkbox came along, for datasets anyways, the only way we'd be able to say, hey, you can see this thing exists without having actual security access to it was over through a data catalog like Purview or a third party. Now, I don't know, are we also going to see discoverable type properties come to the other artifact types? Right now, we can only do it with data sets. So that's where Purview still works for that, but with the caveat that if you have it scan your entire tenant and you give somebody read-only permissions, we can't scope their level of read-only permissions. They see everything across the entire tenant. So for instance, do we even want to expose that there's a workspace with executive bonus reports? There's no need to make that sort of stuff discoverable because it's so highly sensitive. So there's not really a perfect answer right now, but I feel like we're getting there and slowly but surely making progress. The other part of the question was about a data dictionary, and those are great. I absolutely love to document, what does this field mean? We can certainly do that with the descriptions inside of a Power BI data set. And that's good if you're saying that's our authoritative source and that's where we want to maintain it. Even if we get something like Purview, we don't have that detailed level visibility yet into data sets to say, oh, I want to drill down and look at the columns and the data types and the definitions and that kind of stuff. I feel like we're going to get there. So if I were making a decision today to say, what am I going to make do with, I would either say, let's get them into the Power BI descriptions inside the desktop files, assuming that there's not too many of them. Use a spreadsheet as a temporary solution, right? And then as Purview grows up, or a third-party data catalog. They're usually not cheap though. So it would be kind of a big decision to get one of those involved. But, the whole problem with using something like a spreadsheet is that they always get out of date. And it's always a separate thing that you have to go look at. It's not, right there ingrained with the report that you're looking on. So not a perfect solution today for sure.
Thank you. Next question. I currently use Power BI against an SSAS data model, and once the connection is set to that model, it does not allow modifications within the report. Is that limitation removed now, or does that remain a roadblock?
I don't know. I would have to go and take a look. My first thought would be if you can set up a parameter for your connection and run it through that way, and then fundamentally you'd have to be able to change the parameter, but I don't know the answer to that definitively. So if anybody else does and wants to type it in and have Brent say something, please feel free.
Alrighty, and then just wanted to share some praise. Great session as always, Melissa. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I love to talk about this kind of stuff, so thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. And I see some of your submissions for the raffle, and I will be emailing the winner. So I will let everyone go.
Awesome. Well, have a great night or whatever the rest of your day happens to be. It's what time is it here? 7:15 in the evening where we are on East Coast time. So yeah, thanks and take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Bye, everyone.
Bye.